Donald Trump's failed coup back in the news on two fronts. One, the new revelations in the forthcoming book by Liz Cheney, including the whole not eating business, which we can get into with our esteemed guests in a few moments. And this other win for Jack Smith, beating back what had been Trump's lawyers' efforts to try to get involved, turn the system on itself, and demand they should get all these January 6th committee records. A judge rejected that long shot bid as kind of a fishing expedition that was not going to take over the actual trial. And that brings us to the many efforts of Donald Trump and his lawyers, and they have a right to file motions and ask for things, but there is a clear pattern of trying to kind of create this circus rerun of the voter fraud conspiracies in the coup trial, seeking a trove of government material for efforts to use this forthcoming March trial to, quote, relitigate debunked claims that the election was stolen. Now, Special Counsel Jack Smith has made it clear they're going to argue, A, that kind of stuff isn't going to fly. This is not going to be a kind of a random podcast whataboutism session on whether Donald Trump maybe sort of was kind of right about some of the voter fraud stuff that his own attorney general and the evidence already rebutted. They don't think that should fly. They're also arguing in the special counsel's office that Donald Trump's personal beliefs about who even won the election, apart from whether there's any fraud discussion, those beliefs, if he had them, let's say for the sake of argument, he at some point thought maybe he did really win. Legally, they're irrelevant, says Jack Smith. And in a filing, they say it's no different than a company executive facing fraud issues for using knowingly false statements and saying, oh, I really believed him. They back that up legally, and we're going to hear a lot more about this when Donald Trump goes on trial, by the argument that Trump was using deceit and plots that involved fraudulent documents, elector fraud, et cetera, to push people to steal the race. And that's a crime, even if, and here's the kicker, even if Donald Trump, quote, subjectively, like just in his own mind, believed that the election was, quote, rigged. And this is a preview of the closing argument or opening argument or really the through line of the whole trial we're going to hear. Quote, Trump stands alone, Smith's prosecutors write, alone in American history for these alleged crimes. No other president has engaged in conspiracy and obstruction to overturn valid election results and illegitimately retain power. Now, you hear that word, valid election results. That's what the Trump lawyers are hoping to chip away against. That's what they think they might have an in on if they can get a judge to agree to let their stuff in. But as they've found out so far, and again, Donald Trump's presumed innocent and they get to make their case, but they've been finding out over and over that Jack Smith has been cornering them and that this trial is not going to be Twitter or X or whatever you want to call the platform Elon Musk bought that people don't use as much anymore. This is a courtroom. Evidence is what will lead.
I think what is particularly important about Liz Cheney's book is it really creates the incredible, specific, anecdotal storytelling of just how much people like McCarthy knew and understood exactly who Trump was, what he did, what it represented, and yet still went out there and pretended like everything was fine. And while we already knew that, right, it didn't tell us anything that the January 6th committee hadn't told us. I think it is important for reminding Americans really what's at stake here, what these investigations and indictments are all about, and what they have to pay attention to, which is facts versus performance. Because McCarthy has been doing a lot of public performing when she's spilling more tea about exactly what he knew and understood and what he was saying about it. In terms of Jack Smith, look, Donald Trump is politicking here, trying to make more of a political argument than a legal one, I think. But the short answer is Jack Smith's got receipts, and that's what counts at trial.
The Cheney book, though, as you mentioned, not potentially that explosive in terms of the law, is certainly juicy in terms of the tea. The fact that Kevin McCarthy said he was going down to Mar-a-Lago, not to pledge fealty to Donald Trump, but was worried about him because he wasn't eating. And the guy who was the self-designated eating coach is Kevin McCarthy, Speaker of the House.
When you say spilling the tea, that raises the question, was this some sort of special dieting tea?
I mean, the idea that Kevin McCarthy is the Trump whisperer is laughable on its face. But I also think it's notable that, even before Mike Johnson is elected Speaker, she finishes writing this book before Mike Johnson is elected Speaker of the House. and goes out of her way to name check Mike Johnson as an architect of Republican despair, basically rounding up Republican votes to sign on to a foolish amicus brief that even the Supreme Court didn't take seriously. I mean, even before he was anybody, which was like basically yesterday, Liz Cheney understood Mike Johnson to be a bad actor. So I think that says a lot about the Republican Party. And the other thing that stuck out to me was the way she mentions an anecdote with George W. Bush, where he, behind the scenes, writes her a note and effectively congratulates her for standing strong in the face of so much opposition and criticism. And I remember thinking all of yesterday that, you know, at once that's understandable, and I suppose in some way that's laudable for a former president to reach out and pledge his support. But why behind the scenes? Because if you George W. Bush, are not going to make your disdain and dismay known now, when then, right? The former president has, as you talk about often on your show, this show, tried to stage a coup, tried to shred the Constitution. If you're not going to raise your hand and say that's wrong, why bother? I mean, what is the point of passing a note to Liz Cheney?
I think you put that well, and that's why some of these stories can be offered as, oh, this happened, or isn't this interesting? And there's layers beneath it that I'm not sure everyone has maybe completely, accounted for of how you're going to look. And another one that's in that vein is, and let's not forget, these are people who are lawmakers. They write laws that send people to prison, sometimes get people executed. They decide foreign policy questions that send people off to fight and die.
Yeah.
The Cheneys have the history with that, and she's saying, okay, I'm defending democracy. Then you got these other folks who admit they are so afraid of the very people who stormed the Capitol, right? And this is how things get worse. This is how you lose a democracy. There's nothing new about political terrorism in the United States. But if you're going to send other people off to die and you're going to ask the police to protect you, which the Capitol Police did, we all saw, what does it mean when, as Cheney writes, one Republican told Cheney he knew what Trump had done was impeachable, but he was afraid voting to impeach would put his wife and new baby in danger? Maya.
So that's exactly why democracy is in danger, is because you create a culture like Donald Trump created, which one says there will be retribution if you're not loyal to me, right? That's what a lot of what we have seen from Donald Trump has created, but also his power in the party is about the fact that so many people will act, including the way they acted on January 6th, if he sends the right signal. But that means that not only do you have a party that has enabled norm breaking, it's also enabled law breaking, and it's created a chokehold on democracy that says even when we know it's wrong and dangerous, for whatever reason, whether it's our power or our fear, we're going to stay silent and we're going to go along with the lie.
And you get the sense that sentiment, I know it's wrong, but I'm just worried about my own personal either career or family or safety or whatever. But the personal has so trumped the national. And I imagine she talks about Mitch McConnell in there. She doesn't have, it's not exactly a stinging rebuke, but it is a gentle rebuke, I suppose, because McConnell fully understood what Trump did. He was ready to hold him accountable, and then that sentiment sort of dissipated as time went on. But there are a number of Republicans serving in the upper chamber and the lower chamber that feel exactly the same way, though they may not articulate it in those words. They know what's happening is wrong here, but the personal grievances, values, concerns have trumped what is good for the country, and it is apocryphal.
So, go ahead, please.
Well, can I just one point that I feel like we have to make, especially after Koch brother endorsement of Nikki Haley, because now suddenly Trumpism is too extreme, is to forget that the rot begins with the attack on voting rights that starts after Barack Obama wins, and so the notion that you can rule rig to get the outcome you want is really the underpinning of what becomes the big lie on January 6th. And I just think it's important to note that because that has also been very partisan, unfortunately, in terms of who's doing the rule rigging and who defends it on grounds that are not supportable in terms of whether or not our elections are safe and fair.
Yeah.
And so we've just got to come back to the place where there was bipartisanship around things like voting rights. Just fundamental points about democracy where the people decide and the rules matter and they have to be fair.
Yeah. And so to take that's the substance and the law, and then the trial is the coup trial in March is going to do what it does. And then the politics, I'm curious what you think, Alex, because we talk to all these folks, we interview people, we talk to people on air and off. And there is a concern among the reality-based sort of people who want to win Republican elections, and they're concerned that if Trump is convicted, even if he is not incarcerated by November, that being convicted is bad. It hurts him with a certain number of groups, and if he's locked in as the nominee, it will be bad for the Republican Party. That's one piece. The other is, if he, and we don't talk about this all the time, but if he gets a mistrial, I don't think the DOJ on precedent, you can weigh in, will run it again. Jack Smith oversaw the John Edwards trial, and they got a mistrial, and they didn't run it again.
Yeah.
There's a view that, although they will run it against certain people, we could talk about that. If you're a big picture, prominent former government official, it's one and done. And if he were to get a mistrial, meaning not be convicted, it will play not only to the hard right as this great validating win, but a lot of other people will go, and the polling suggests this, Alex, oh, well, they didn't convict, then there's nothing there. And there's a long ways from beyond a reasonable doubt to nothing there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't traffic in hypotheticals, Ari. I honestly think the thing I'm most concerned about in terms of the trials is the appeals process and the delays. Because, I won't get into all the weeds here, but there are a number of things that need to be decided by the D.C. Circuit Court, by Judge Chutkan, before that federal case can even go to trial in early March. And there is every reason to believe that Judge Chutkan wants to keep the train on the track and start this thing at the beginning of March. She may not be able to. And so what concerns me is if there is no conclusion here, not a mistrial, not a conviction, but an ongoing series of pretrial.
If I may.
Yes, please, you're the lawyer.
And this is
I just play one on television.
Deep cut, a proverbial hanging Chad that hangs for months.
Wow.
To bring back a painful election memory.
Yeah. Well, listen, no, actually, Bush v. Gore is a great example of how the Supreme Court and how the appeals process can work quickly should they choose to. But it's it's an open question about whether the American voter in nonpartisan fashion gets to know whether the man who is the likely nominee of the Republican Party is a convicted felon or not.
Yeah.